Hold on, you're saying that potions can be personalized? He looked at the large bottle in his hand labeled with a paper note declaring it to be elixir number 5. Cecilia nodded. Like mole medicines, though cost-effectiveness precludes it. The next part, the match, is the one that links to your endocrine system. This is the bit of you that controls hormones, said Harry quickly. Controls hormones, finished Cecilia, looking intriguingly at Harry. Well remembered. This has a dual function in a wizard. Not only is the physical energy from spells metabolized here, but also... Cecilia stopped, wondering whether she should continue. Yes? Asked Harry, setting down the half-full bottle of elixir base. Is linked to emotions. She looked down at the base, then back at Harry, reining in her anticipated excitement of the direction of her thoughts. She had considered emotions before, but had not gone as far as mentioning it to Snape, and other things had taken priority. Tell me, Harry, does it matter, when you cast spells, how you are feeling? Harry frowned, and Cecilia realized she wasn't making herself clear. Are there any differences to the effects of a spell, depending what mood you're in? Harry's face turned into a picture of comprehension and he nodded. Yes, emotions change spells. Professor McGonagall tells Ron that all the time. He's not that good at transfiguration, you know, and when he goes in feeling like he can't do it, the effects are worse. I mean, he went in once, thinking he had ancient runes, and the transfiguration lesson went much better because he wasn't wound up about it. And, like, with the unforgivable curses, you have to mean the pain and suffering, or it won't work. Cecilia said nothing for a moment, considering what Harry had just told her. The emotional state of a wizard had a bearing on the efficacy of a spell. Professor McGonagall said that was another reason why the school was founded, 1,000 years ago, so our minds could be trained to cope and we could be more proficient. We could learn these things at home with our families, but here, it's a better environment, Harry added in a concerned tone of voice, her lack of response making him feel uneasy. Cecilia nodded again. Yes. That made perfect sense. The training of minds to let go of emotion, or to channel it appropriately. And it meant she could use this information in the plan of her own. Okay, said Cecilia, looking at her desk for the 9 blended potions they were working on that day. There's something I need you to try for me. We need to go to somewhere bigger, more space, and somewhere we won't be disturbed. Somewhere where no one will be at this time of day. In the silence that followed, the only sound that could be heard was a far-off chant of Quidditch team supporters screaming the name of their house, Go, Go Gryffindor. Slytherin. In. The defense dungeon, said Harry, that'll be empty. Everyone's out watching the match, anyway, he added regretfully. As they stepped out into the corridor, Harry followed Cecilia along it and towards the Defense Against the Dark Arts classroom, carrying 5 of the blended potions in their vials. Around them the chants were growing louder, punctuated sporadically with louder cheers as one team or another scored a goal. Cecilia turned the handle of the defense classroom door, making her way to the desk, not dissimilar to her own at the top of the room, and placed the samples on it. The last time she had been here, she had tended Snape's wounds, dressing them in myrtlap essence to prevent infection and wondering with all her might how he had come to sustain them. All too well Cecilia knew now, had it been because of her that he had been caused that pain. Before we begin, Mrs. Frobisher, can I ask you something else about the potion? He placed the sample vials he was carrying next to those that Cecilia had placed on the table, looking round the dark, cold dungeon. What is you need to know, Harry? The potion. How does it work? What will I feel? What will it be like? Cecilia looked at Harry, before sitting down on the chair by the defense desk. I have told you, have I not, that when the potion is finished, it will be as perfect as ever we can make it. Harry nodded in agreement. looking earnestly at Cecilia as she sought the words to continue. "It will do its job. You will cast a spell that will destroy Voldemort, one that is controlled in part by your emotions. That spell will be the only one you can cast, for at that moment, all your other magical abilities will be subdued, reduced right down, in effect adding more power to the one which you must cast. That is to say, your own magic, anything magical of you Harry Potter, will be gone, and what will be left is what Voldemort transferred to you as a byproduct of your mother's love. The protection that Voldemort took from you will be returned, and in so doing, you need to channel it into the spell to which the potion will be attuned. That's how it works. I cannot begin to describe to you how you will feel, nor what it will be like. Perhaps you could save that question for Professor Snape." Cecilia raised her eyebrow, waiting for Harry to confirm that he was satisfied with what she had told him, and eventually he turned back to face her, nodding. "Let us begin, shall we?" Cecilia said, getting to her feet. The dungeon, though cold, was the right size for the spell she needed Harry to conjure, and she proceeded to instruct Harry as to the spell he was to cast. Half an hour later, and Cecilia had recorded the effects of the Patronus charm that Harry had used to defend himself on 18 occasions against the 9 potions. She had instructed him to perform the charm twice, the second time to change his emotional thought to incorporate a feeling of fear of failure. Once or twice, Harry seemed to lose focus, but he managed to hold his Patronus, a glowing white stag, on each occasion long enough for it to act as a shield against the benign potions. A drained and exhausted Harry staggered back to one of the benches once he had finished. Cecilia crossed over to inspect the samples, noting any differences in appearance, color and texture before labeling them accordingly. She would need to analyze them scientifically later on, glancing over her shoulder at Harry and marveling at how well he had worked. Once she had finished, she told him so, congratulating him on his magical abilities. "I've been wondering, Mrs. Frobisher," Harry replied, "you say when the potion is ready. Have you used what you left the castle for last week?" He broke off, a blush entering his cheeks. Thought Cecilia, I wondered when we'd get to that. "I've used every piece of information that I've collected where it was intended, Harry. The sample I collected from your parents' house I have used as I intended to. It will have made the final potion safe for you." Cecilia crossed back over to the table she made to collect more of the potions again, while the information she had given to Harry sunk in again before she asked him to perform another spell. Assembling the evaporating dishes on the same bench where the potion samples had been just now, she made her way over to the recovering young wizard, whose breathing rate had decreased now that he was resting. "Tell me about your teachers of defense," she continued, sitting across from Harry, handing him a handkerchief to mop his perspiration-drenched brow. "I understand you've had a good many of them over the years." Harry nodded in agreement. "Professor Yellis is our 5th, he agreed. "He's not bad actually, far better than the maniac we had in the first year, Quirrell." Harry looked darkly at Cecilia, who registered the tale Harry had told her about Voldemort's parasitic existence underneath his turban. "The best was our 3rd year professor. The one we had in our 2nd year was a twit, and we had Moody in our 4th, though Barty Crouch Jr. in disguise." "You like defense, I take it," said Cecilia, smiling at Harry a little. "It's just so cool," he enthused, "but not when we have to do theory. Doing the practical is far better, just like science," thought Cecilia, watching as Harry made his way towards the back of the classroom, clearly recovered from his exertions of the Patronus charm, and made his way up the pulpit-like stairs and into the room at the back of the dungeon. Ignoring the teacher-like alarm in her mind that a student was entering, for want of a better word, a staff room, Cecilia followed Harry into a medium-sized office that contained what looked like Professor Yellis's belongings. The room was about as big as her bedroom in the teacher's quarters, and she stopped in the process of chastising Harry for interfering. "Here," said Harry, handing Cecilia a book. The spine bore the title, Defense Against the Dark Arts, and it was written by Hestia Noble, a witch, Cecilia mused, that seemed to know a great deal about defense. All the spells we're supposed to know for our owls, said Harry, darkly. We've hardly had a chance to cover them, though Hermione's learned them by heart. How are we supposed to do our practical when Yellis won't let us practice? Each lesson we seem to cram from this stupid book. Cecilia nodded, recalling similar teaching exercises in Mull schools. On behalf of all the teachers everywhere, I apologize, laughed Cecilia, handing the book back to Harry. Sadly, it is the way of examinations these days. There is little in the science curriculum that depends on practical ability. Not so can be said of defense, she added sympathetically. Harry nodded, replacing the book back on its shelf. The best bit about magic is doing it, continued Harry, picking up what looked like a set of short stubby keys from Professor Yellis's desk. I mean, when we could actually see the boggart, and we could defend ourselves from it. And when we learned about how to bewitch fire and trap fairies for their glow. Harry's eyes glazed over as he reminisced. We learned loads, and had a really good time when Professor Lupin taught us Dash. Cecilia felt her face begin to glow, and she looked down at the floor. Of course she knew Remus had taught defense, but she hadn't expected Harry to mention his time at the school with such fond reverence. I'm sorry, Mr. Frobisher, Harry began, putting down what he had picked up from the table, but Cecilia raised a hand. Don't be, Harry. Now Dash. There's something I would like to ask you, Mrs. Frobisher, Harry interrupted quickly. You came back when you're not really involved in this now. Why? Cecilia stopped, steadying herself on the huge oak table in the center of the defense office. That wasn't the question she was expecting Harry to ask her. She swallowed, pushing her emotions deep down inside. I am as involved as anyone, Harry, she said steadily. 800 moles were murdered by Voldemort at Halloween. Events like this that have taken place in the Mole world might have had repercussions on. Cecilia stopped, rephrasing what she was trying to say. The same could be said about you, she continued, looking into Harry's green eyes, darkened in the failing light. You could have told Dumbledore that you wished to quit, your mother saved your life, and you could have continued to live your life at Hogwarts without Voldemort concerning you. Yet you chose to become involved for a reason. As Cecilia trailed her sentence off into nothing, she saw Harry's features change into comprehension. Tell me about Christmas Eve, at Grimmauld Place, Harry said quickly, his tone forthright and instructive. Though catching her off guard, Cecilia shook her head, a gesture of finality in it. Nothing that transpired that has a bearing on this work. I made a promise, Harry, that I wouldn't get involved with your lives anymore and remain professional. But you are involved. You're part of the wizard world, Mrs. Frobisher. The look of astonishment Cecilia gave him made him look away. I can't depend on anything if you're not involved in the potion, he confessed quietly. Cecilia smiled kindly. You flatter me, Harry, far more than I deserve. Dash. I am actually sorry for what I did, Harry continued, ignoring Cecilia's protests. I'm nearly 16 and I should not have attacked you. And if I could apologize on behalf of Sirius I would. Cecilia stopped. That was the first time that she had ever heard Harry speak out against Sirius Black, the man who was as close to a father figure to Harry as anyone could be. And you act like everything's cool between us, continued Harry. Aren't you angry with me? No, said Cecilia softly. I should be, I suppose, but I'm not. What good would that do? Nor with Hermione. Cecilia shook her head. Then what can I do, Mrs. Frobisher? Asked Harry, his face now much paler and filled with concern. Cecilia sighed and began to walk towards the fireplace, the dying embers giving way to crackling sparks, and began to look into it. You can listen to the information that is given to you, considering everything in its entirety, and then make up your own mind. You are nearly of age in this world, and when you are, you'll realize, if you haven't done so already, that, as an adult, the consequences of your actions fall back into your own lap and you have to take responsibility for them, whatever the outcome. She turned and looked at Harry, who seemed to have grown paler still and was beginning to shake. That, and make sure Ron and Hermione are at least on speaking terms when I'm gone, she added. When you're gone? Asked Harry, shocked, his mind racing through ever-incredible possibilities. Gone where? Cecilia smiled. When I return to the Mole world, replied Cecilia lightly. When it's all over. Harry looked at Cecilia, his eyes narrowing slightly as uncertainty appeared momentarily in his mind over her last answer. Could I ask you something else, Mrs. Frobisher? Harry pressed, changing the subject. His tone was much quieter and more reserved now. It's a personal question, he clarified. As long as it is not repeated, Harry, then you may ask me anything, as were the terms of our agreement. Harry nodded, before picking up the stumpy keys again. You were married. What does being in love feel like? At Harry's words, Cecilia began to feel as if the door to her private emotional store had been kicked open. She ran the question over in her mind for a few moments before finally settling on an appropriate choice of words. It's like, she began, looking pointedly at Harry's face, like you would do anything to make sure that the person you care about wasn't hurt. Was safe. It feels like you would sacrifice anything of yourself, of your life, if it meant they were truly happy. A moment passed where neither Cecilia nor Harry said anything. Both of them retreated into their own worlds, contemplating her words in the darkening environment of Professor Yellis's office. Finally Harry looked at Cecilia. Did you love Lupin? The question hung in the air for a few moments as Cecilia absorbed what Harry had asked her. She could feel a lump in her throat grow quickly and she fought the bitter, stinging pain in her chest, her nose tingling as she analyzed the question. Yes, Harry, I do. I love Remus Lupin very much. Cecilia swallowed, fighting back her emotions, and she fixed her thoughts on the set of books on the shelf above Harry's head, waiting for them to pass. Now I know why Dumbledore didn't insist on a greater punishment for me, Harry thought as he watched the spectrum of emotions that appeared on Cecilia's face. This is punishment enough, knowing what she's done on my account. I never realized there was so much behind what she was doing. I beg of you not to ask any more of me, I fear it is unprofessional. She smiled as best as she could at Harry and, gesturing towards the door of the office, added, we should get back to the task in hand. Now, the next spell I need you to carry out is probably going to be complicated, said Cecilia when they were back in the center of the defense dungeon. Harry followed Cecilia quietly as she made her way to the table where she had placed the potions beforehand. I need you to focus on your good memory that you use for the Patronus charm, she continued, put the 9 completed potions into the dishes, their contents glimmering milkily. It's Mum and Dad, said Harry as he watched her pour out the potions. They're my happy memory. Cecilia turned to Harry, spilling a little of the 4th potion onto the table as she looked at the young wizard. Harry, Cecilia began, but he shook his head. I know what you mean about love, he continued, smiling at her broadly now. It's like they did what they could for me. Mum's emotion. Mum's love. She helped me by changing the spell, altering it. Cecilia said nothing. Harry's words were enough, they were truly insightful. I can see the importance now, he pressed on, grinning now as the words came tumbling out of his mouth. Thank you for going, Mrs. Frobisher, and getting what you needed. Thank you for caring so much about this. Cecilia was about to reply, but at first she did not know what to say. It was not her own personal intrinsic feeling of care for Harry that had driven her from Hogwarts, neither was it selfish. more a care for the quest of perfection, of pride she supposed. That was the closest description she could find. For she was determined at the outset to ensure that Harry did not consume the potion nor undertake the task himself in any case. Which, if she supposed, amounted to her caring for his welfare after all. If I can share one last thing with you, Harry, before we proceed with the nullification spell, the effect of the spell, thanks to your mother's love, caused you, in more scientific language, to have had an immunization against Voldemort. When he uses his magic against you without your other powers shielding them, you will drain more of his until there is nothing left of him. There is one spell you will need, and we will only know if it will work for sure if you take it when you carry out the plan. This is why the plan is so dangerous, Harry. Cecilia picked up the 5th potion and swiftly poured an aliquot into the evaporating dish before recorking what remained and picking up the 6th. Which spell is it, Mrs. Frobisher? Asked Harry quickly, the urgency and excitement in his voice preventing her to press them back to their work, and for a split second it crossed Cecilia's mind to tell him. She sighed, and pulled out the stopper from the 6th potion. For this information I refer you to Professor Dumbledore, as this concerns the part of the plan connected to the Order. I am not at liberty to tell you it. But can you tell me what will happen afterwards? Cecilia stopped and turned to Harry again, regretting again that afternoon, telling him that she would speak to him honestly. At worst, I cannot predict the effects. You may die. At best. She paused, setting down the 6th potion and picking up the 7th. There is no guarantee your powers will ever return. 88,888,888. Harry. Sirius, I shouldn't be here. Your letter said it was urgent. Before the fire in the charms classroom, Harry sat cross-legged in his pajamas, his invisibility cloak gathered in a heap by his side. Harry. Yes. I need to speak to you, Sirius hissed, the green flames crackling about his head as he spoke. Harry shuffled in his sitting position, hoping that it wasn't going to be like the last time he and Sirius talked via the Flu network. I take it this isn't connected to the McGonagall's fireplace, said Harry, recalling how mortifying it had been when she had replayed their last illicit conversation with Sirius in front of Dumbledore. Quite safe, whispered Sirius quickly, recalling to his own ignominy. Look, something's up, Harry. Mrs. Frobisher Not her again, Sirius, complained Harry, rolling her eyes. She's actually been through a lot, And she will go through a lot more unless you heed what I have to say. The Order is ready, prepared, for you to use the weapon. Dumbledore put us on alert, including me, which can only mean one thing. Harry shuffled again before the fireplace. Whatever the effects of the potion, it's going to be so powerful that it won't matter if I'm in the open or not. You still don't have to take it, Harry. Think about it. Think about your parents. I am serious, I have. And Dumbledore's right. Wizards have died. Exclaimed Sirius, shaking his head. Yes, agreed Harry evenly, many of them, and moles too. Even those from your own family tried to stop it. The enemy's Voldemort, not moles. I know. Harry paused uncertainly. As much as he loved Sirius, he couldn't quite bring himself to share the confusing feelings that were locked within him at the moment. I don't need to know, Harry. I have long since got over the idea that Mrs. Frobisher is going to harm you. However, she is in danger. Harry stared at the inflamed features of his godfather speaking to him in the hearth. Listen carefully to what I am about to tell you, Harry, for the consequences may yet concern you. It appears that Snape and Kreacher exchanged mutually beneficial information at Christmas time. Kreacher informed me that Snape is to hand Mrs. Frobisher over to Voldemort in exchange for his life. Sirius stopped speaking, his features flickering every so often in the Flu light. Harry felt his mouth fall open. It's Snape I'm concerned about, the git, continued Sirius, snarling as he spoke his adversary's name. He's there, controlling everything. Controlling her. Like he always had to be. Harry looked at his godfather, taken aback slightly at Sirius's vehemently open insult of Snape. He was aware he didn't like Snape, but this was the first time Sirius had expressed such bitter anger about him in front of Harry. "Then we have to warn her," whispered Harry, leaning closer to the fireplace. "We have to tell her what's going on." He waited for his godfather to acknowledge him. Time passed. "Look, you shouldn't even be speaking to me," hissed back Sirius. "I'll admit, I don't like what she's done, what she's doing, where she went last week, but I don't relish the thought of what will happen to her in front of Death Eaters, especially since I declared her misborn." That didn't make sense, thought Harry. If she was warned about it, then she wouldn't be facing them. "So you're sorry then?" Sirius stopped and looked at Harry quickly. "Harry, I am ashamed of actions. Do not get me wrong, I dislike Mrs. Frobisher and all that she stands for. However, I was mistaken to call her such a cowardly thing and encourage you to do likewise." Sirius hung his flaming head 8 inches from the hearthplace. "I am no better than Regulus for it." Harry said nothing, waiting for Sirius to make the next move. He knew about Sirius's brother, of course. Living at Grimmauld Place for a summer and 2 Christmases meant things like that leaked out osmotically. But he had never heard Sirius talk about Regulus, or use his name. The few times he had talked about him in Harry's hearing, he had referred to him as "that brother of mine, mother's favorite." But what did he have to do with all this? Harry waited and more time passed, so much so that Harry began to believe that the Floo connection had become faulty and had frozen. Eventually Sirius moved and looked directly at Harry, and when he did, Harry was sure he saw tears in his godfather's eyes. I once declared another mole misborn, Harry, and was the cause of their death." Sirius's voice was hushed and low, and Harry shuffled forward to hear him. "The mole was tortured and killed in order for another loyal to Voldemort to prove his allegiance. I do not wish it to happen again." Harry said nothing. Sirius had done this before? And that was the result. He swallowed a few times as he digested the information, holding himself back from pressing Sirius for more details. "Mrs. Frobisher's made the potion," said Harry finally, "and I'm actually glad she went and got a bit of Mum. She's making sure it'll all work out fine." A bump outside the classroom door made Harry break off, and he turned quickly in its direction. "I've got to go," said Harry, reaching for his cloak. "Someone's out there." "Find out, Harry, for your sake. Find out what the potion contains and what it is designed to do." Sirius looked urgently at Harry as he got to his feet. "There's more to this than meets the eye. Promise me." As Sirius's head faded in the grate, Harry threw on his invisibility cloak, disguising himself from sight as the charm's classroom door handle rattled. "I promise," thought Harry, as Argus Filch peered inquisitively round the door, searching no doubt for intruders. "I promise, Sirius, that for once I'm going to ignore your advice and do what I agreed to do." 88,888,888. It was nearly 2 in the morning of the last Saturday in February, and Cecilia had not yet gone to bed. She cast her glance at the array of potions, both blended and single base and match, that stood on the table at the back of the Mole Studies classroom. Looking down at her notebook and back to the potion she had just blended, Cecilia's heart sank low again as the flobberworm she had just dosed with the latest batch stopped writhing and began to turn yellow, a sign that it had gone to meet its maker. "Just like the last 370 I've killed in the last 6 weeks, thought Cecilia grimly as she took it away from the others and threw it into the fire. At least Harry had been an asset since he had visited her and apologized for his actions, and, true to his word, he had attended every evening to assist Cecilia in a wizardly capacity, performing the spells she'd asked and, to Cecilia's somewhat grateful relief, keeping questions strictly professional. Harry talked about Ron and Hermione with Cecilia, what they were studying in other classes, his visits to Hagrid''s. Small talk. Through his help Cecilia could say, hand on heart, that she had nearly found the match that went with the base, elixir number 5. With the exception of the toxicological effects, it fitted every other criterion, being neither too energetic nor weak, being neither too great nor small in frequency. The ingredients complemented one another, and the potion as a whole blend responded as she expected to the emotional challenge. Here she was, yet again, Cecilia Frobisher, standing in the Mole Studies classroom completing yet another batch, ready for Harry to investigate tomorrow, which would be both a step towards one goal and at the same time take her away from another. And now, stirring the thinning black substance which pervaded pungent fumes, staring out of the classroom window into the dark night, the answer to how she was going to carry out her plan, fully formed, crept into her mind like a spider creeping over her shoulder and into her ear. It was that simple. So simple. So easy. Cecilia put aside her aggravation of Snape's absence from their work. He was teaching once more, though visiting the hospital once a day for treatment, and she had been visiting him when he allowed her to, in order to keep him up to speed with their developments, and contemplated the plan and its plain simplicity, wondering why it hadn't occurred to her before. Perhaps, she thought, it was because of the information she was writing into her notebook of her pursuit of the ratio of ingredients in the match. It could, on the other hand, be because she had reread as the next batch of potions were on the boil. Another alternative was that it was a case of reductive factors, her mind going over and over the possibilities subconsciously and re-evaluating the variables as they changed. Whatever the reason, it didn't matter. She smiled to herself in the dark environs of the Mole Studies classroom, because now she, Cecilia Frobisher, suddenly knew exactly how she was going to make it all right for everyone. Shortly after Cecilia had thought those thoughts, she found herself negotiating her way into the Gryffindor common room, past the fat lady. Students obviously did not realize how well compliments worked when one was short of the password, and into the large, welcoming sitting room. Looking round, Cecilia wondered where she needed to go next. However, she did not have to visit the girls' dormitories to find Hermione, as the young witch was sitting on a chair by the dying fire with her head in her hands. Hermione was happy enough to help her, explaining to Cecilia that she and Ron had had another row, but at least they were talking, and just about friend. He understood that she liked him, she said, liked him like that, and that it was okay. And when the girl returned the conversation to Cecilia's nocturnal visit, she removed what was tucked up in her jacket pocket, a little vial of a particular potion, all ready for use. But Cecilia was a mole, Hermione had insisted. Cecilia wasn't able to use a wizard potion without coming to harm. Never, Hermione had added, could Cecilia brew it herself. It would always be an inert blend of herbs and innocuous bits of animal under Cecilia's powerless hands. Had anyone looked at the scene in the common room, they would have seen the Mole Studies teacher and one of the school's brightest fifth-year students engage in a hushed, animated but brief discussion, following which, Hermione and Cecilia sealed their pact by shaking hands. "Thank you," said Cecilia as Hermione saw her hurriedly out of the common room. "You've saved your friend, you know that?" "By Mrs. Frobisher," added Hermione as Cecilia climbed through the hole that led to the back of the fat lady's picture frame. "Oh, I almost forgot to tell you," she added, and Cecilia stopped, waiting for the young witch to finish her sentence. 15 centuries ago there were such things as research wizards, who worked out the best spells for wizards to use. The standard ones that we learn. That Hogwarts students have always learned. That's great, isn't it?" she added, obviously waiting for Cecilia to be equally thrilled. "Sorry, Hermione, it's been a long night." "What's great?" Hermione took a few steps towards her teacher. "Well, they did what you are doing now, but for wizards." She nodded and Cecilia nodded too, the brilliance of such a young mind illuminating the common room's darkness. And then Cecilia took a slow walk back to the Mole Studies classroom, the urgency to get there almost entirely absent now, and the random thought to check Snape was sleeping restfully in the hospital wing as she had done each night since his horrific torture dissolving to nothing as the thought of her plan concealed it. True, it depended on the potion being perfect. But there were a few less things troubling her mind now. Cecilia Frobisher awoke to the school clock tolling 5 o'clock, and to the rhythmic beat of Dobby rocking her desk violently, and she realized she had not only slept in the classroom again but, more importantly, she had not completed the latest potion. Lady did not come to dinner last night, scolded the house elf, his bobble hat bouncing around his head. Nor did Lady come down to the kitchen to fetch any. Morning, Dobby, Cecilia yawned, wiping the sleep from her eyes and throwing her dull and lifeless hair over her shoulder, and smiled wearily at the house elf. How would it be if I came down to the kitchen now and helped you with the dinner? Cecilia watched as the offer of her company made Dobby pause in his leaping around and grin excitedly. But of course Lady is always welcome in the kitchen, Dobby is sure of this. But Lady should take care, for she is in dreadful danger. His voice was an agitated squeak as he began to hop from one foot to another. Cecilia smiled and she got to her feet, knocking a few pages of her loose-leaf notes onto the floor. Thank you for warning me, Dobby, she replied, stooping to pick them up. I'll make sure I'm careful. Making her way to the door, Cecilia stopped as Dobby stood in her way. But Lady is surely coming to the kitchen now. Lady is not going back to her room. Cecilia stooped to his level and smiled again. Lady is going to her room, having a hot bath and getting changed before she comes down to see Dobby, Winky, and Bingo, declared Cecilia firmly, and, picking up Dobby by his middle, she placed him to one side and stepped out of the classroom, bumping into 2 students who were bent at half height with their ears pressed to the door. Harry and Ron looked at each other sheepishly as they backed towards the sandstone wall of the classroom corridor. Lads? Asked Cecilia, surprised. What are you doing here, out of dorms so early? She looked between the 2 waywardly faces before her, then adding, why are you following me? Mrs. Frobisher, began Harry as she looked doubtfully at expressions, you must stop what you're doing. Yeah, agreed Ron, nodding his head. What do you mean? Asked Cecilia, feeling a flush of guilt sweep over her as she took a step towards them. You've got to stop what you're going to do, Mrs. Frobisher, continued Harry, his voice and mannerisms adamant and bold. We need to tell you, Mrs. Frobisher. We know something's going on with you and Professor Snape. Ron looked at Harry and nodded in agreement. Whatever do you mean, Harry? Cecilia asked wearily and shaking her head in disbelief. Did they know? Had Hermione told them? Snape, said Ron urgently, stepping forward and looking earnestly at Cecilia. He's going to betray you, Mrs. Frobisher. He's going to hand you over to the Death Eaters in exchange for his life. Cecilia felt her face freeze in an effort not to laugh hysterically and smiled instead, trying not to let her mirth at such a preposterous suggestion show. Professor Snape what? She asked seriously. Look lads, Professor Snape is the most loyal friend I have here. He is an honest man who has never once let me down. Cecilia watched the look of incredulity pass between them. It's sweet of you both to care, she added, but I trust him. And you should trust me if it's the potion you are worried about, Harry, she added, patting him on the shoulder consolingly. But you have to trust me that it will be the safest I can make it. She smiled at Harry and Ron, nodding to indicate that she had spoken her final word on it. But Mrs. Frobisher, Cecilia held up a hand. Harry. We're telling you the truth, exclaimed Ron, hotly. We, overheard him telling Malfoy. Harry looked at Ron, an expression of confusion fleeting across his features. Cecilia laughed. Aroused no doubt, probably to protect our cover. Cecilia smiled inwardly as she saw the defeated look pass between them now. And if you're here so early in the morning, Harry, perhaps you could examine the next samples I prepared last night? I'd like your opinion, she added as she proceeded back into the Mole Studies classroom. The boys followed her as Cecilia made her way to the selection of potions on the back table. "How's it going with Hermione now?" continued Cecilia conversationally to Ron as Harry looked at the mixture, and Ron began to blush red again, looking pointedly at one of the potions in a vial on the table. "Okay," he conceded, "but we had a row." Harry gave him a knowing sidelong glance. "Well, Hermione fancying me is no worse than you fancying Tonks," he exclaimed. Cecilia chose that moment to pay close attention to the flobberworms that appeared to be asleep in one of the containers to the left of the latest potion, allowing Harry's flush of embarrassment to wane before addressing him. "I think it'll change with the nullification charm," said Harry. "It was like the one you made on Tuesday, but because you've altered it a bit, it'll hold out longer." Cecilia nodded. It was exactly what she hoped Harry would say, which meant it would be exactly what they needed. "So I'll see you later this evening, Harry?" Cecilia asked, smiling at the two errant young wizards. "I'll have blended the next one by then, and we'll have 3 to work with." "Can we help you?" asked Ron, excitedly. "We can come back later to help, both of us. Please," he added, pleadingly. "Haven't you got Hogsmeade to go to?" Cecilia asked, recalling the 2 sentences she had read on a piece of parchment a couple of days ago, which meant the 5th years were excused from their Saturday lesson, and she watched as the look on Harry's face changed to misery. "I'm banned from Quidditch or Hogsmeade trips because of what I did," he began, and Cecilia nodded in confirmation as she ushered them towards the door. "Well, we'll see how much fun we can make this, shall we? There are still plenty of spells we haven't tried yet." After a quite interesting, if not very productive Saturday, Cecilia took herself back to her room at tea time to contemplate the results of her findings. From what she could see, the boys had managed to narrow down 3 blends of the secondary potions that would be a suitable match for Harry's base. 2 of the 3 matches seemed almost perfect, giving results in the correct energy and frequency ranges to inhibit 3 of the most emotionally dependent spells that Harry had used, but it just depended now on whether they would produce sufficiently compatible with the base potion and whether they would yield acceptable results with the use to the Avada Kedavra curse. But it didn't worry Cecilia now, as she paced her room in front of the wardrobe that shielded her from any watchful eyes that might appear in the fireplace, past her locked door and dully lit room. What was occupying her thoughts at the moment was whether she would be able to enact her own plan quickly enough once they had got the perfect blend without being stopped. She had the objective, and the means. But it had to be planned well to succeed, and at the moment there was too much room for error. She threw her clothes into a huge pile, and walked through the door into the bathroom, anticipating the soothing soak, her mind filling with every permutation and outcome possible. Half an hour later, and with darkness falling, Cecilia walked back into the Mole Studies classroom. To her utter shock and amazement, she found Snape looking through her 8th, and latest, notebook, the pages open at the work that Harry and Ron had carried out that day. "Tell me," he said, looking up as she entered, "how you have managed to be so successful with the match in my absence." Cecilia looked past him at the bubbling cauldron, then back to Snape, trying not to let her feelings of spill over into her voice or actions, and she occluded her emotions as she concentrated on the facts. He was well. They could continue. "I had the assistance I was promised. And it was lucky I did," she added chidingly. "I don't usually allow ill health as an excuse for absence." Cecilia smiled inwardly at his immediate cold frown. "It is lucky then, that my absence is not permanent. Otherwise you might never have come to the correct conclusion when you choose 2 incompetent students to assist you." Snape turned and looked at the contents of the cauldron, and Cecilia made her way over to him. he was well. I don't understand, Severus. Cecilia frowned, looking at the liquid that was congealing around the inside of the pot. I retested the base, which was fine, then made the match which Harry tested. And look, it's still doing that to the flogger worms. She pointed towards a pot on the table that had been the result of an impedimenta jinx. I told you it was ready. Both parts, began Snape, in a low voice, looking at Cecilia and ignoring the deceased magical creatures. The match, to your specifications, is clearly at least an order of magnitude out and it's still causing fatalities, Cecilia argued, gesturing at the potion's unfortunate victims. Snape's eyes narrowed, and he turned slowly to look at the test subjects. They were clearly dead, unable to absorb and metabolize the energy from the spell, and Cecilia folded her arms, ready for the fight. The potion in its current state was the correct energy and frequency for Harry but would probably kill him. I told you this was ready, he repeated sternly. And I am too tired to argue with you. The weapon has to be completed tonight for the widespread attack on groups of moles to celebrate the Dark Lord's return as planned. Once it is completed, I am to instruct Harry in carrying out the spell and alert Minerva to contact the Order. Cecilia felt her mouth drop open. It was the first time Snape had openly admitted weakness to her, but what caught her more off balance was that he had just told her directly of Voldemort's plan on the counter-offensive. Her first instinct was to worry at the insistence of science on demand, and the next was to question Snape to make sure she had heard correctly. Instead, Cecilia smiled happily for the first time in 2 months and picked up the base solution. Let's finish this, shall we? 88,888,888. Now we should have it. Snape paced around the cauldron that sat over the large seething fire. Cecilia went to retrieve it, but Snape had already unhooked it from the large iron hook from which it had hitherto been suspended and summoned it to the backbench. She made her way over to the table, watching intensely as he landed the flying cauldron on an iron trivet. He was right, thought Cecilia as she investigated the contents, and it would have been perfect weeks ago if she had not misread Snape's handwriting and had used boomslang skin instead of bomberskin skin. For the dozenth time that evening she felt a pang of imperfect worry enter her stomach. If only she had not departed the castle almost a month ago, then Snape probably would have not been tortured, and she would not have made such a mistake they had spent the last 6 hours correcting. Was this enough time, she wondered, for Snape to test the Avada Kedavra spell? Would he allow her to speak to Harry as a diversion while he sent word to Minerva that the potion was ready so she could enacting her plan? Distantly, the school bell tolled 11 and, as Cecilia recorded the information of the match potion that they had spent the preceding time honing the match to perfection, she shivered, taking her notebook back over to the match, recording its appearance and consistency. Perfection. Perfect. They were at liberty to say that now. Ignoring the toxicological tests, the match, as the base, had passed all the other criteria and would, if taken by Harry at the most opportune moment, allow him to curse Voldemort using the Avada Kedavra curse and thus destroy him. In her head, the words sounded so simple. In a matter of hours, the world's most terrible threat, both to moles and wizards, would be gone, and those who were involved could bask in the aftermath that freedom would bring. As her mind drifted to its efficacy, Snape stood next to her, looking analytically at the match that they had made. Cecilia turned slowly to him and spoke softly, putting down her notebook and chewed biro next to the potion. "It's so nearly perfect, Severus," she began, "but we still don't know what will happen to Harry." She looked away quickly from him and back at the match, feeling her heart sink at the prospect that at some stage soon Harry would be asked whether he was still willing to risk his life for the sake of the plan. The orange sludge that was the match potion expounded gas bubbles infrequently, and she turned to Snape, who was still looking at her. "So nearly perfect," she lamented softly, looking down. Snape tilted her chin so Cecilia was looking at him, and he put a finger to her lips. "It's close to perfection, Cecilia. It will do the job." Light was shining in Snape's eyes for the first time that she could recall. Relief, thought Cecilia. It would be over for him as much as anyone in a few hours. "But Harry," Cecilia insisted, shaking off Snape and walking back towards her desk. In the days to follow she was determined that no one should think that she was ignorant of the boy's well-being, even though he wouldn't be taking it now. Snape followed her, taking up her notebook and, wordlessly, opening it to the page of results that Cecilia herself had written. It was perfect, Cecilia thought, scanning the numbers and figures. On paper it passes all the tests. We cannot determine, or control, what will happen once the potion is used. Cecilia nodded, closing the notebook. She had known that all along. Looking at the rest, piled untidily to one side of her desk, her mind fleeted over the events of the weeks and months that she had come to know in this world. It was perfect. The perfect blend of science and magic. "Severus, when I'm gone, could you make sure people know about this? I'd hate to think of all our hard work gone to waste." Cecilia turned quickly and spoke hastily to Snape. Behind him the match exploded, a small gas bubble on its surface. "Gone?" he asked, his wrinkled brow wrinkling further. "Gone where?" "Home," clarified Cecilia guiltily, "and my memory modified. I've done what I was employed to do. We've made Harry's potion." A wash of emotion began to build in her stomach. And now it was over, for her at any rate. It soon would be. Snape took a few steps towards the pile of books, opening the front cover of one of them. "Well, it would seem you have made an extremely conscientious effort to preserve our work," he intoned, scanning down the contents page. "I have barely had time to read all of their contents. No doubt Professor Dumbledore will be impressed. He approves of such things," he added wryly. Snape took a couple of steps towards Cecilia, and she noticed that his expression had changed to one of near serenity, if that were possible. Far less troubled than she had ever seen him. "Before that unhappy fate that you have described befalls you, Cecilia, we must make haste. And I would be remiss in the professionalism as a colleague, and regard as a colleague, if I did not admit to you that whatever your endearment for other wizards whom you have had, if I may say, the misfortune to cross your path, we made a good team." He broke off as Cecilia shot him a look. "You know about—" Cecilia stopped. Was he being sarcastic? "I know of your feelings for Black. I am given to understand that his embrace is extremely hard to ignore." Cecilia looked at him in astonishment. That was the last thing she expected Snape to say to her, now of all moments. "If it makes you feel any better, Cecilia, you are not the first," he added. "What? How?" spluttered Cecilia, trying to understand what Snape was trying to tell her. He knew about their kiss. He was regretful of Sirius's condemnation of her. Occlumency is a powerful tool, though not given the credit that it undoubtedly deserves. So few choose to study it with any degree of seriousness. Snape continued to stare at her fixedly as Cecilia's mind filled with defensive thoughts. She folded her arms indignantly. "You've been reading my mind?" she exclaimed. "What exactly have you found out?" "Only that," he replied, his face still and voice steady. "I interpreted your feelings for your own protection, Cecilia. Minds are not as a book, to be flipped open and read at leisure. I knew you had followed me that evening, of your birthday. I wished to see that you were safe." He watched her face grow redder and more annoyed. "If it makes you feel any better, this was the first and last time." "Why doesn't that surprise me? Another wizard thinking he can take what he likes without considering my feelings." She broke off her quiet rhetoric and looked down, feeling somewhat foolish that she had trusted yet another wizard. Why was he telling her this, though? "Your mind is particularly stubborn, Cecilia, Snape continued, taking a few steps towards her. When I knew he had invited you to the Yule Ball, I was concerned for your safety. I intended to accompany you for your own protection. Black has taken my life before. Not a day has gone by that I have not regretted my answering the call. But Cecilia was not listening now. Sirius. He wanted to kill me all along. She shook her head in disbelief, and Snape took a few more steps in her direction. That has always been Black's plan, that you would not return to Hogwarts and complete the work. I warned Dumbledore of my suspicions. However, our past history somewhat colored Dumbledore's interpretation of my warning. And as such, the supercilious, arrogant charmer almost managed to make his plan succeed. He'd admitted as much. Sirius had no feelings for her. You would not have been the first mole to be killed at his hand. What a fool she was. He'd used her. Played her as he's played Snape for a fool all those years ago. When I'm gone, she thought to herself, looking up into Snape's dark, unfathomable eyes, maybe they will be kinder in viewing the courage of moles. However, perhaps if you had exceeded my warning. Snape shook his head mockingly, as if sharing a long-past private joke, and Cecilia cursed inwardly at her own stupidity. Yes, it's my impetuosity that you love the most, Severus, she said bitterly, turning her head and looking at the ingredients of the match potion, laid out perfectly on the page in her final notebook. No, it's your mind I love the most, Cecilia. She turned back quickly to look at him and opened her mouth to say something. Snape put a finger on her lips.